I'm just a grandmother who once believed that love given freely would always return. But what happens when you give everything, your time, your health, your youth, your money, and in the end, you're left alone with nothing but silence? I still remember the way the house felt that morning. Cold. Not because of the temperature, but because of the way no one looked at me when they passed by. My son brushed past me in the hallway with his phone in hand, laughing at something his wife had texted. My daughter-in-law barely muttered a word as she took the breakfast I had cooked, like I was the hired help. I had lived in that house for 6 years after my husband passed. I thought moving in with my son's family would be a blessing, a way to stay close to them, to help raise the grandchildren, to fill the lonely hours. But somehow, somewhere along the way, I became invisible. There was no celebration for my birthday this year. Not even a card. My grandson Jacob didn't even know it was my birthday. He's only 7. And how could he know if no one told him I had made him pancakes that morning? Heart-shaped ones, just like I always did. He smiled. He still loved me. But the rest of the family didn't even notice. It's a strange thing, the kind of loneliness that creeps in when you're surrounded by people. It's worse than being truly alone, because at least when you're alone, you expect the silence. But when you live in a house full of voices that never speak to you, footsteps that walk past you without pausing, laughter that doesn't include you, that silence becomes unbearable. I sat at the edge of the couch that morning, my tea cooling in my hands, staring at the photo wall. There were pictures of the children, vacations, birthday parties, but not a single one of me, not even from when I first moved in. I remember thinking, did I even exist here? The final push came later that day. My son and his wife were arguing in the kitchen about money again. I never meant to eavesdrop, but their voices weren't exactly low.
She's costing us more than she's helping, my daughter-in-law hissed.
Maybe we could ask her to move to assisted living. Quietly, he replied. I froze. After all I had given them. After I cashed out my savings to help them buy this very house. After I watched their kids cooked every meal, kept the house clean. After I gave up everything I had left to ensure they wouldn't struggle.
Now they were planning to get rid of me.
They didn't even know I had heard. They just continued their lives as if I didn't exist, as if I were already gone.
That night, I couldn't sleep. I laid in the dark room they had given me, the one next to the laundry, with no windows, feeling every inch of the betrayal settle deep into my bones. I realized something painful. I wasn't family to them anymore. I was an expense, a burden, a ghost.
It was the moment I realized I didn't matter to them. Not anymore.
But something else happened that night too. In the deepest pit of heartbreak, a flicker of something stirred inside me. Not anger, not yet, but awareness. And awareness is the beginning of everything. I had given them my life, but they had taken it without thanks, without care.
That night, for the first time in a very long time, I whispered to myself, I don't deserve this.
It was a whisper, but soon it would become a roar. Before I tell you what I did next, I think you need to know where I came from, because my story didn't start the day they ignored my birthday. It started decades before the moment I chose to give all of myself to others, believing that love and sacrifice were the same thing. I married young, 17. Back then it wasn't so uncommon. My husband Charles was a man of ambition but little patience. He had dreams and I had devotion. So I worked. I cleaned. I raised our son. I took extra jobs when times got tough, sewing, babysitting, even working nights as a cleaner at the school where our son would one day attend. I never once complained. Not out loud. I believed that being a good wife, a good mother, meant putting everyone else first. I lived by that. And for a while, it was enough.
But Charles, well, he didn't stay the man I married. He became harsher over time. Not with his fists, thankfully, but with his silence, with his expectations. I was always not quite enough. The food could have been warmer, the house cleaner, The bills paid quicker. He never once asked how I felt. He didn't care.
Still I stayed, for our son. And oh, how I loved that boy. When he was little, he used to climb into my lap and say, "Mommy, you're my favorite person in the whole wide world." And I believed that love would last forever. I taught him everything I could. I read to him. I packed his lunches with little notes. I sewed his Halloween costumes. Even when we couldn't afford fabric, I used scraps. He never knew we were poor. He grew up smart, kind. At least I thought so. Somewhere along the way, maybe when he went to college and I stayed behind, something changed. He became a man who didn't need his mother anymore. He got married, had kids, and invited me to live with them after Charles passed. I thought it was kindness. I thought, finally, I'll be part of a home again. But it wasn't kindness, it was convenience. I helped with everything. I watched their children for free. I cooked, cleaned, organized school events, stayed up with the baby when she cried. I even gave them my savings when they were struggling, every cent I had left from Charles's life insurance. I didn't hesitate. That's what mothers do, right? Except I wasn't a mother to them anymore. I was a live-in maid they didn't have to pay. And slowly, their words became sharper. Their eyes colder. I started hearing things behind closed doors. My daughter-in-law telling my son that I was too much. That I was getting in the way. My son never defended me, not once. And yet, I stayed. Because I still believed that someday the love I had poured into them would come back. But the truth is, sometimes love is a one-way road. And when you give too much of yourself without boundaries, people stop seeing you as a person. They see you as something they own. That realization, it was like stepping into cold water. Sudden, harsh, unforgiving, but necessary. Because it was the first time I allowed myself to ask, what do I want? What do I deserve? The next morning, I woke up and looked at myself in the mirror. Really looked. The lines on my face, the silver in my hair, they weren't signs of weakness. They were proof I had lived, and I realized I still had time left. Maybe not a lot, but enough. Enough to reclaim something of myself. They took my savings, my dignity, my place in the family. But they hadn't taken my will. Not yet. And I was about to remind them very quietly what happens when the one you underestimated finally opens her eyes. I'd always believed that love, real love, was proven through sacrifice. That if I just gave more, helped more, stayed quieter, I would be cherished. But that belief broke the morning I overheard them. It was a Saturday. I'd just finished folding a basket of the kids' laundry, tiny socks, superhero pajamas, little frilly dresses, and was heading down the hallway when I heard my son's voice behind the closed door of the master bedroom. "She's exhausting," he said. I froze. "I know she's your mom," my daughter-in-law replied, "but this is our house, our life, and she's always here, always in the way." I stood there like a ghost, just outside the door. My heart felt like it had stopped mid-beat. "She means well," he muttered. "She gave us her money. Great. That doesn't mean we have to be stuck with her forever. She doesn't have anywhere else to go." There was a long pause. Then she said something I will never forget. "She should have planned better. It's not our fault she has nothing." My own son didn't say a word in my defense. He didn't tell her to stop. He didn't remind her that I raised him when I had nothing, gave him my life. He was silent. That silence spoke louder than any insult ever could. That was the moment. Right then. Standing in the hallway holding a towel folded with love, that was the moment I knew. They didn't love me. They tolerated me. Because I was useful. And once I stopped being useful, I'd be gone. I walked back to my room slowly, sat on the bed, looked around at the framed pictures of them I'd lovingly arranged on my dresser. Their wedding, their babies, even a photo of my son as a child holding my hand. And then I cried, not the loud sobbing cry. No. It was the kind of cry that leaks out quietly while you try to breathe through the ache in your chest. the kind of cry that feels like you're grieving someone who's still alive. Because I was grieving the son I thought I had.
For the next few days, I went about my duties like normal. I smiled. I made breakfast. I picked up the kids from school. But inside, I was different. I had a new clarity, a new resolve. I realized I had given away my power one tiny piece at a time when I said yes instead of no, when I handed over money without question, when I accepted crumbs and called it gratitude. I had allowed it, out of love, out of fear, out of habit, but I wouldn't allow it anymore. That night, after everyone went to bed, I took out a notebook I kept in my drawer and began writing down everything I remembered about the money I'd given them, the hours I'd worked, the things I had done for them since moving in. Every dollar, every task, every sacrifice.
Not because I wanted revenge,
But because I wanted truth.
because the first step to reclaiming your life is remembering your worth. I didn't know what I was going to do next.
But I knew this. I would no longer live like a ghost in the home I helped build. I would no longer be silent. And whatever came next, it would come from a place of dignity.
Because even if they never apologized, even if they never loved me again, I would love myself, and that would be enough to begin.
You know, people talk about dying of heartbreak like it's some poetic exaggeration. But I can tell you, it's real. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in slow, invisible ways, like when someone walks past you without looking, when your name is left out of family plans, when the people you love stop asking how you're feeling. That week, after overhearing my son and his wife, something inside me faded. They didn't hit me. They didn't scream. But their silence cut deeper than any blade. Suddenly, I was no longer invited to the dinner table discussions. I'd make meals, and they'd eat in the living room without me. When I spoke, my voice floated in the air unanswered. When I entered a room, their eyes glanced toward the floor or their phones. They stopped calling me Mom. They started calling me her. She left the stove on again. Her medicine's on the counter. Is she even still watching the kids or just napping all day? I became background noise in my own life. The children, my grandchildren, still clung to me with innocent love. They'd ask me to read stories, to sing to them like I used to. But now, when I'd kneel down to hug them, I'd hear my daughter-in-law's cold voice from the kitchen. Don't bother Grandma right now. She's tired. Tired. Yes, I was tired, but not from age, from abandonment, from being slowly erased by the very people I built my world around. I started keeping to myself more. I'd sit in the guest room that used to be my sanctuary, but now felt like a storage closet. The walls were bare. My old curtains had been replaced. My books were boxed in the garage. I didn't even recognize my own space anymore. They didn't even notice when I stopped joining them for meals. They didn't knock when I stayed in my room for hours. They didn't check if I was cold or hungry or lonely. Sometimes I'd watch the shadows change across the wall and wonder, was I already dead to them? But then something shifted. One evening, I found my old photo album tucked behind a pile of boxes in the garage. My hands trembled as I pulled it open, snapshots of a young woman with hope in her eyes, holding a newborn boy wrapped in a blue blanket. That boy was my son. I flipped page after page, birthdays, scraped knees, graduation, his wedding. I remembered staying up all night sewing his prom suit because we couldn't afford a new one. I remembered cashing out my retirement early to help him with the down payment on this very house. This house that now had no room for me. As I stared at those photos, something stirred inside me. Not sadness, not rage. Clarity. They may have forgotten, but I remembered. I remembered every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every silent prayer I whispered for their happiness. And I thought to myself, if I could give all of that, surely I could find the strength to take something back, not out of revenge, but for survival, for healing, for peace. I didn't want to be a burden, but I also didn't deserve to be discarded. And in that moment, surrounded by dusty boxes and faded memories, I made a quiet decision. I would find a way to reclaim my life.
I didn't know what it would look like yet. I didn't know how far I'd have to go. But I knew this. They had taken enough, and I was not finished yet. That night, I stayed awake with the photo album resting on my lap like a holy book proof that I once mattered, that I once lived not just as a ghost in someone else's house, but as a woman, a mother, a wife, a giver of life and love. I found a pen and paper and I began to write. Not because I planned to send it, not yet, but because if I didn't release what was inside of me, it would drown me. It started like this. To my children, I gave you my life. You gave me silence, and then it poured out like a river breaking through a dam. I wrote about every penny I lent them when they were in trouble, about the years I spent standing between them and disaster, about how I held their babies when they needed rest, how I cheered at their graduations, how I prayed when they were lost. And I wrote about now, about how it felt to be invisible, about how much it hurt that no one asked if I was okay, that no one noticed the woman slowly disappearing in the corner of the house. The pen ran out of ink halfway through. I took it as a sign. Maybe it wasn't time to send it yet, but something had shifted. That letter never sent became the seed of a plan. The next morning, I did something no one expected. I asked for a ride to the library. My daughter-in-law raised an eyebrow. "The library, yes," I said, smiling faintly. "I want to use the computer," she scoffed. I didn't care. At the library, I sat down at a dusty computer, logged in with the help of a kind teenage librarian, and typed into the search bar, "Resources for elderly women abandoned by family." Click, scroll, click again. I learned about housing options, legal protections, support groups, senior centers, and most importantly, programs that helped women like me regain independence. Quiet, free, dignified programs built by people who understood that family wasn't always where you were safe. I wrote down numbers. I picked up pamphlets. I spoke softly to a woman in a gray blazer who looked me in the eye, not over my shoulder. That afternoon, I didn't go home immediately. I sat in the park for 2 hours thinking, could I really do this? Leave the house I helped pay for? Walk away from the grandchildren I rocked to sleep? Would I be selfish or finally free? That night, back at the house, my son didn't notice I was gone longer than usual. No one did. But I noticed something. I noticed that I felt lighter, like a woman quietly reclaiming the pieces of herself that were scattered across decades of sacrifice. I kept going to the library every week, made calls when no one was listening, even began visiting the senior center where I met women who had lived through worse and come out stronger. Women with bright eyes and quiet strength. Women who told me, you're not alone. That's when I started imagining a life outside these walls. A room of my own. A chair by the window. A cup of coffee in silence that didn't feel like punishment. And maybe, just maybe one day, I'd send that letter. Not out of spite, but as a way to say, you forgot me, but I never forgot myself. There comes a moment when you stop asking for someone to notice. You just start moving, quietly, softly, but with certainty. That moment came to me one rainy Tuesday morning. I had just returned from the senior center where a woman named Lorraine, gray-haired, fierce, and funny, had looked me in the eye and said, "Why are you still living like a guest in your own life?" She meant it kindly, but it stung, because it was true. That evening, I went back to the bedroom where I'd spent so many nights silently crying, listening to my family laugh in the living room, while I felt like a ghost just floating past them. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. "I'm leaving," I whispered aloud, just to hear the words. And then I said it again louder. "I'm leaving." It didn't sound crazy this time. It sounded like a promise. Over the next 2 weeks, I sold the gold bracelet my mother had given me, the one I had saved for my granddaughter's wedding, but she had barely spoken to me in years. That money, I used it to secure a room in a shared senior housing apartment. Small, modest, but clean. And mine. I didn't tell anyone, not yet. I packed a single suitcase. My clothes, my letters, my photos. my memories, everything that mattered. And then, one Saturday morning, while they were all out, probably shopping or brunching, I left a note on the kitchen table. I gave you everything. You gave me silence. I am no longer waiting to be remembered. Mom. I walked out the door without looking back. No dramatic scene, no crying, no begging anyone to ask me to stay. I stepped into the cab with my suitcase in hand and my heart pounding like I was 17 again and running away for the first time. The senior living house was painted pale blue. There were wind chimes on the porch and flower boxes in the windows. It smelled like lavender and safety. My room was small, but it had a window. A real window. And I sat by it that first night drinking tea and staring out into a world that for the first time in years felt like mine. The next day, Lorraine knocked on my door and said, "You did it." I nodded. I didn't cry. I just smiled. Weeks passed. No one called. Not my son. Not my daughter-in-law. Not even the grandchildren I raised like my own. But I didn't break because something inside me had shifted. I began volunteering at the senior center. Started taking watercolor classes, read books again, walked in the park without fear of being hurried home. People saw me, not as just grandma, not as a background figure, but as Elaine, a woman with thoughts, with stories, with dignity. And one day, weeks later, my phone rang. It was my grandson. "Grandma," he said. His voice cracked. "Where are you?" I paused, then said softly, "Somewhere I should have been years ago." Silence. Then, through quiet sobs, "I'm sorry. We didn't know." I didn't reply right away, because I wasn't sure what to say. I had left them without anger. But I had found myself with peace, and I wasn't sure I was ready to trade that again. Have you ever been so used to silence that even kindness feels loud? That's how it felt when I moved into my new place. The senior living house wasn't luxurious. No polished marble, no gold chandeliers like in those magazines my daughter-in-law used to flaunt. But for the first time in decades, I could close a door and know that what happened inside that room was mine. My space, my peace, my dignity. Still, peace doesn't come easy when you've spent your life serving others who never said thank you. That first week, every time I sat down with a cup of tea, I'd hear phantom voices, my son barking, "Where's dinner?" or the grandkids yelling for help with something they never appreciated. I had lived like a live-in maid with no paycheck, and now I lived alone. And strangely, that was healing. One morning, Lorraine invited me to a community breakfast. She handed me a flyer and said with a wink, "Real food. Real people. Real laughs." It sounded like a miracle. I wore my best blouse, a pale lilac one with buttons like little pearls, and for the first time in years, I curled my hair. I didn't do it for anyone else. I did it for me. That breakfast changed everything. There were other women there, old, wise, tired, and bright-eyed like me. One had left an abusive husband in her 70s. Another had raised 6 children who all forgot her name once they got married. We shared eggs, coffee, and more than a few tears. "I thought I was alone," I whispered. "You were just unheard," one of them replied. "Now we're listening." As days turned into weeks, I started to write. Letters to myself. Letters to the girl I once was. Letters to the woman I had become. I didn't write out of bitterness. I wrote to understand, to grieve, to forgive not for their sake, but for mine. And through every page, I found pieces of myself I thought had been lost. My laugh, my humor, my dreams. Yes, dreams. Even at 78, I had them. One afternoon, while sitting on the porch watching leaves dance in the wind, I saw a familiar face walking up the garden path. It was my granddaughter, Sarah. Her eyes were red. She held a small bouquet of daisies. Her voice trembled when she spoke Grandma. I didn't know. I didn't rush to hug her. I didn't say, "It's okay," because it wasn't. Instead, I said the truth. "You didn't want to know, but you came now, and that matters." She cried into my arms like she was 5 again, and in that moment, I knew this was the start of something new. Not a full reconciliation, not a fairy tale, but maybe a single seed planted in the soil of truth. And I, an old woman with shaky hands, would water it if she came back.
But this time, I wouldn't beg her to, because I had finally learned love is a gift, not a debt.
You know what's strange? For so many years, I was a background character in my own life. A quiet fixture in the house. I cooked, I cleaned, I comforted. I poured myself into others until I was an empty cup cracked and forgotten on the back shelf.
But one day, I looked in the mirror and I didn't see Grandma or Mom or Honey. I saw me,
Just me.
and I whispered aloud, "I'm still here."
That day, I went to the local library. I hadn't been in decades. The smell of old pages greeted me like an old friend, and the librarian, a young man with tattoos and soft eyes, asked what I was looking for. I smiled and said, "Oh, beginning." He handed me a book on writing memoirs. "Your life's probably more interesting than fiction," he joked. Oh, if he only knew.
I began writing every morning. I wrote about the first time my husband shouted at me in public, about the time my daughter borrowed money and never repaid it, about Christmas mornings spent alone in the kitchen pretending to be joyful while no one noticed my silence.
I wrote it all, and as I wrote, I didn't cry, I bled. Ink was my medicine. Truth was my therapy. A few weeks later, I was asked to share at the community center. A small reading, 10 people, 1 microphone. I almost said no, but something inside me whispered, "They silenced you once. Don't let them win again." So I stood before them and read. They took my life and called it duty. They took my voice and called it love. But I am not empty. I am not broken. I am still a woman. I am still enough.
The room was still.
Then they clapped. And not the polite, forced kind of clapping, but the kind that says, "You spoke for all of us."
That night, I slept better than I had in years.
Not because anyone apologized. Not because I had money or comfort or praise. But because I had reclaimed the one thing I had given away for too long. My worth. Not borrowed. Not conditional. Not dependent on anyone else's opinion. Mine. I was 78 years old. And finally free. After that first reading, word spread faster than I expected. People, especially women my age, started calling the community center, asking when I'd read again. Some said they'd cried. Others said they saw themselves in my words. One woman even hugged me so tightly after an event, she whispered, "I thought I was the only one." I knew then I wasn't just telling my story. I was telling ours. It was surreal, you know. For decades, no one had really listened when I spoke.
Not my children, who saw me as a resource. Not my husband, who saw me as background noise. Not even myself.
But now strangers leaned in when I spoke. They nodded, cried, and felt it. And that gave me something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Purpose. One night, after a reading, a woman about my daughter's age came up to me. She held a copy of my self-published booklet, her fingers trembling. "I gave up everything for my family," she said. "And now they treat me like I don't matter. Your story? It's like someone finally turned the lights on." I hugged her. Not because I had the answers, but because I knew what it was to live in the dark. Then came the twist I didn't expect. My granddaughter showed up at the next event. Not because she was invited. She came because someone at her yoga class mentioned this older woman who writes fire.
She didn't even realize it was me.
When she walked through that door and saw me standing at the mic, her face turned pale. She sat in the back, arms crossed. I kept reading, and when I finished, she didn't say a word. She just walked up, eyes glossy, and said, "Grandma, I had no idea. We sat in the cafe down the street for 2 hours. She told me how she'd always thought I liked being quiet,
That I chose to be invisible.
She admitted how often her mom, my daughter, complained about me being too sensitive or stuck in the past. I told her, "Honey, when people don't want to deal with truth, they call it drama." She reached for my hand, and for the first time in my life, someone in my family really saw me. Not as a helper, not as a burden, not as a background figure, but as a person. Sometimes the first apology doesn't come with words. It comes with a look, a pause, a quiet "I didn't know." And in that moment, I forgave what I could. Not for them, for me. Because carrying rage is too heavy for bones already weary from love.
but remembering telling the truth, that is freedom. Not long after that cafe conversation with my granddaughter, something unexpected arrived at my mailbox. It was a letter from my daughter. I stared at the envelope for hours before opening it. Her handwriting hadn't changed, still neat, controlled, slightly slanted, as if she were always trying to write perfectly, even when she couldn't speak plainly. Inside a single sheet of paper. No, dear Mom, no love, just the truth. I read your story. I didn't think it was real. But now I know, and I'm sorry I never asked. I hope someday you can forgive me. I don't deserve it. But I'm asking anyway. I sat there, letter in one hand, tears in the other. You'd think I'd feel triumphant. But honestly, I just felt quiet. Not angry, not joyful, just still. The kind of stillness that only comes after decades of noise guilt and self-doubt. It was the first time I realized I didn't need her to grovel. I didn't even need her apology. I just needed me to stop carrying her silence like it was mine. That night, I didn't write a new poem. I wrote a reply. It wasn't flowery or poetic. It was real. I raised you with everything I had. I gave you my youth, my dreams, my hope. You didn't know how deeply I hurt, and maybe I didn't know how to show it. But I forgive you. I forgive you not because you earned it, but because I refuse to live in a prison built from pain you handed me. I mailed it the next morning, and I never looked back. My community readings turned into regular events. Soon I was invited to share my story at women's shelters, book clubs, churches. Everywhere I went, I'd meet women who'd say, "That could have been me." And I'd answer, "It was you. It is us." We'd cry. We'd laugh. We'd rage together. And heal. Because sometimes healing doesn't come from the ones who hurt us. Sometimes it comes from strangers who see us clearly. One day as I was leaving a reading, an older man approached me. Wrinkled hands, kind eyes, and a voice like gravel softened by honey. He said, "You reminded me of my mother. I ignored her until she died. You made me want to remember her differently." And right then I realized, even if I'd lost my family, even if I'd been abandoned, even if I'd been taken for granted, I hadn't been invisible. Not anymore. You see, sometimes we give everything and they give us nothing. But in reclaiming your story, in telling it out loud, you begin to give yourself back everything they never did. And that is everything. My 80th birthday came on a rainy Thursday. The kind of soft, drizzling rain that feels like the world is sighing, gentle but weighty. I woke up early, made myself a cup of tea, and sat on the porch like I always do. The birds didn't sing that morning. Even they seemed to know something was missing. No calls, no messages, not a single happy birthday. Not from my son. Not from my daughter. Not even a stray Facebook reminder from an old friend. Once this kind of silence would have broken me. I used to stare at my phone, willing it to ring. I'd refresh my inbox, hoping some magical apology would show up. But that morning, I didn't cry. Instead, I whispered to the rain, "I remember me. That's enough." Still, when afternoon came, I put on a little lipstick. Not for anyone else. For me. I wore the blue shawl I crocheted myself during one of my lowest winters. I lit a single candle on a cupcake I bought the day before. I said out loud, "To the woman who gave them everything, and finally gave herself something. Happy birthday." And then, just as I blew out the candle, someone knocked at the door. It was the local librarian, Sarah. She had a small paper bag and a nervous smile. I didn't want to intrude, but I remembered you said today was your birthday during last month's poetry night. Inside the bag, a used copy of a book I mentioned loving in my youth, a notebook, and a card that simply said, "The world is better because you stayed." I stood there clutching that bag like it was treasure. Because in that moment, it was. Sometimes the people you birthed forget you, but the world doesn't always. Sometimes the family you built walks away, but strangers quiet and kind can build you back. It took me 80 years to understand you don't need 100 candles or a table full of guests. Sometimes the best birthday gift is knowing you're finally living for you. That night, I wrote a poem. One I didn't share at any reading. It was just for me. She sat alone, not lonely with years behind her,
like waves, soft, strong crashing. And as the candle flickered, she realized she had always been the flame. I was folding towels on a quiet Tuesday morning when the doorbell rang. The sound startled me. Not many people visited anymore. My world had become so small, so quiet, that any sudden noise seemed to echo louder than it should. I wiped my hands on my apron, walked carefully to the door, and opened it. There was no one there, but lying on the welcome mat was a single envelope. No name, no stamp, just thick cream paper and handwriting I recognized immediately. Mark's. My hands trembled as I picked it up. I hadn't seen my son in almost 3 years. Not since he looked me in the eyes and said, "You gave us nothing but guilt and control." Not since he and his wife had emptied my savings and left me in the old house to fend for myself. I sat down on the sofa, staring at the envelope for what felt like hours, before finally sliding a finger beneath the seal. Inside was a simple note. "Mom, I don't know if you'll read this, but I've been thinking of you every day since we last spoke. A lot has happened. If you can forgive me, I'd like to talk. I miss you. Mark." I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. My heart felt like a tight knot pulled even tighter. Was it guilt that brought him back? Was it need? Or was it real remorse? But what surprised me most wasn't his letter. It was how calmly I read it. 3 years ago, this would have shattered me. Now, I had changed. You see, in those years of silence, I rebuilt something stronger than trust in my family. I rebuilt trust in myself. And part of me, the wiser, braver part, knew this letter wasn't the ending. It was a test. Would I respond with the same love I always gave so freely, the kind that was always taken for granted? Or would I choose a different path? I folded the letter slowly and placed it in a drawer next to a journal I'd been writing, in entries filled with everything they never knew. I felt the fear, the rage, the heartbreak, but also the courage, the rediscovery. I didn't answer his letter that day. I needed time. I needed to remember who I was before I had given everything away. Later that evening, as I sat under the warm light of the living room lamp, I began to write back, not to Mark, but to myself. "Dear me, today, someone from your past reached out. You are not obligated to carry their weight again, but you can choose peace. And this time, peace begins with your boundaries." It was the first time I'd truly written for myself, and it felt like freedom. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, dancing across the wooden floor. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the birds peck at seeds I'd scattered on the porch rail. Life had become simple, quiet, and oddly fulfilling. But my heart was unsettled. Mark's letter still lingered in the drawer beside my bed, like an old wound reopening, not bleeding, just aching. His words, "I miss you," echoed in my mind, not as a balm, but as a question. Was he missing me, or the convenience of me? I boiled a pot of tea and sat by the window with my journal. I wrote again, "Love without respect is just a debt that never gets paid back, and I've paid that debt for decades." That afternoon, I walked into town and entered the small library, my new sanctuary. The librarian smiled, recognizing me as the woman who now spent hours reading about things I'd never had time for before gardening art women's memoirs. That day, I picked out a book on boundaries. You see, part of healing is learning what to allow, not who to forgive blindly. When I got home, there was another letter. This time, Mark wrote more. Apologies, memories from childhood, even a picture of my grandson I hadn't seen in years. And in the end, a plea. "I want you in our lives again. Please." I sat with that letter for hours. My fingers traced the edges. My eyes scanned the words again and again. But the only thing I kept hearing in my mind was something I wrote weeks earlier. "Don't walk back into the fire just because it's the only place you were ever noticed." That night I wrote a response. Not cruel, not cold, just clear. Mark, I will always love you. But love has to come with truth. You left me when I needed you most. You didn't just take my money, you took my dignity. And I had to rebuild that alone. If you want me back in your life, it won't be on guilt and it won't be in silence. It'll be through real, honest healing, and I won't be the one doing all the work this time. I mailed it the next morning.
No fanfare, no expectations, just my truth.
And it felt like placing a stone in the foundation of a new version of me.
Not a version shaped by what others took, but by what I finally gave to my self-respect. And that was the beginning of everything I never knew I was allowed to have. Weeks passed. No letter, no reply. And strangely, I didn't mind. It wasn't indifference. It was liberation. I had spent so much of my life setting a table for others, cooking, cleaning, forgiving, serving second chances like bread baskets. But for the first time, I set a table just for me. I took myself out to a little cafe with red checkered tablecloths and jazz playing in the background. I ordered whatever I wanted. I smiled at strangers, and no one asked me to shrink. At home, I rearranged the living room, took down the old family portraits that once reminded me of duty and sacrifice. In their place, I hung landscapes, sunsets, and a painting of a woman sitting alone on a bench, peaceful, not waiting. I joined a local quilting group. We laughed, stitched, and cried over tea. Women like me. Women who had been forgotten, overlooked, or simply survived. One of them, Denise, said something that struck a chord in my bones. You can mourn the people you lost, even if they're still alive. That night, I lit a candle and sat with that grief, because that's what no one tells you. It's not just the betrayal that hurts. It's the letting go of the dream that one day they'd see you, understand, you love you fully. But dreams die, and in their place, real life can begin. Mark eventually replied, not with excuses this time, just a quiet confession. I didn't know how to be a man who deserved a mother like you. I cried reading that, not because I needed it, but because it meant I no longer did. I had finally walked out of the role they cast me in, and into the life I'd written for myself. Every step forward from here wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about redemption. And the woman I was becoming, she didn't need a crown. She wore her resilience like armor. And she knew one truth deep in her bones. When they give you nothing, you learn to make everything from scratch, including your peace. If you're still listening, still hoping, still hurting, I want to talk to you now.
Not as a victim, not as a hero, but as a grandmother who gave her life to others and got nothing in return except the strength to finally begin her own.
I don't know your story. Maybe you've been used, abandoned, ignored. Maybe your kindness has been mistaken for weakness. Maybe you've stayed silent so long, you forgot what your own voice sounds like. But hear me when I say this. Your story isn't over. Not yet.
They took my years. They took my money. They even took my hope for a while.
But what they couldn't take, what they never even saw, was my spirit.
And when I finally stood up, even if my legs trembled and my heart ached, I stood in truth. I stood in dignity. I stood in me.
So if you too are a mother, a grandmother, a woman who gave everything and received little,
let this story be your whisper in the dark. You don't owe anyone your silence. You don't owe anyone your suffering. You are not just someone's past, you are your own future.
And to those who still think it's too late, let me remind you, the most beautiful flowers often bloom in the second spring. Your time is not behind you. It's within you, right here, right now, in this breath, in this choice to say, enough, I am worth more than what they gave me. So go, reclaim your life, start over, speak out.
And one day, when they finally notice what they lost, you'll already be living the life they never gave you.
Because you gave it to yourself, with love from one forgotten grandmother who will never be forgotten again.